divers are special? Well, you can say they're special because they're stupid enough to go underwater, which is very unkind. However, they're special because you understand breathing. Equally, you understand pressure. And as I'll show, you will actually understand that bubbles can be circulating. At this point, I've got to bring in my own profession because it's very important for you all to realize that there is no training in our medical schools relating to pressure, relating to diving, or for that matter, to aviation. It simply is not a requirement of the General Medical Council. I've been involved in commercial diving now for 40 years, working offshore, doing experimental work, mostly human, very little animal work, but also training divers who actually are in saturation, so-called saturation. And that is a privilege I've had over many years. And altogether, our school in Dundee trained, I think the total was 641 commercial divers. So our focus this evening is on oxygen, which is a truly vast subject. The chemistry of oxygen itself is a vast subject, which we can only lightly touch on. It actually is capable of accepting an electron. The oxygen molecule then becomes a free radical because it has an additional electron. If it did not do that, we would not be here, because that acceptance of an electron is what drives energy in mitochondria. But we're also going to focus on bubbles, which in divers form foreign objects in the circulation in blood vessels. So, first of all, a little bit about atmospheric pressure, because people talk when they go in chambers of going under pressure, when we're all under pressure. The Earth is a pressure vessel, and the gas is kept on the surface of the Earth by gravity. I'm sure you all know it's a kilogram per square centimetre, 1,013 hectopascals or millibars or whatever term the physicists decide to use. So gravity, in creating barometric pressure, creates a sea of air in which we exist. And of course, the pressure changes with the weather. In Scotland, it changes by over 10%. So when somebody is given 100% oxygen in hospital, which is a rare event, the amount they actually take in depends on the barometric pressure and can be 10% lower on a very low pressure day than it is on a high pressure day. And of course, pressure falls with altitude. 10 meters of air pressure is equivalent to about 1 millibar or 1 hectopascal. The gases air contains oxygen, nitrogen, argon, water vapor, and of course traces of noble gases like xenon. Air, of course, is a nitrox. And just a brief reminder that it wasn't always 21%. In fact, in the era of the dinosaurs, the atmospheric oxygen was 35%. So a good deal of the development that we call evolution, in fact, took place in 35% oxygen. So what are the effects of immersion? It's a stepped increase in ambient pressure. And that means that the gases that dissolve in blood create osmotic effects, gas-induced osmosis, which actually redistributes water. So part of recompression therapy by an abrupt increase in pressure actually is osmotic. Of course, increased pressure also increases the gas partial pressures, according to Dalton's law. And so in diving, the bulk of you will dive using nitrogen as the diluent gas, but some of you I know will have used helium and some will have used trimix. So the gas uptake of nitrogen is related to its partial pressure. And so for a given percentage, it depends on the depth or varying depths. And a given percentage of oxygen, if you increase it, means that you reduce the nitrogen content. The time is the duration at depth, but also the gas uptake depends on the workload, because the workload determines the cardiac output, and it's also directly related to the partial pressure of oxygen that you're breathing. Now, the problem with blood flow is it varies in the body, and even within the nervous system, there are areas of very low blood flow as well as very high blood flow. So, for example, areas of the spinal cord have low blood flow, whereas the brain in general, especially the grey matter, has extremely high blood flow. The highest blood flow, of course, being actually in the retina. But if we look at connective tissue like ligaments, the blood flow is an extremely low level. It is also intermittent. So a given area of ligament, connective tissue or tendon actually can have blood flow open, for example, for about 45 minutes, and then it closes down simply because the oxygen it's delivering is not needed. And so with the closure, the gas transfer is changed from being delivered by blood flow to being delivered by diffusion. Well, no mention of decompression can fail to acknowledge the committee appointed by the Lords Commissioners of the Admiralty, which gave John Scott Haldane the job of sorting out decompression sickness at the turn of the last century. Until this committee reported in August of 1907, there were no decompression tables, and it was extremely arbitrary. The Dutch government, for example, insisted by law on linear decompression. So John Scott Haldane, you can see, born in 1860 and died in 1936, based his tables on the established no-stop decompression. He actually talked about it in fathoms, and it would have been in feet, about 42 feet. He soon backed off to 33 feet of seawater pressure, and actually said when he floated the concept of no-stop decompression that there would be no symptoms due to bubbles. Unfortunately, in a sense unfortunate, his tables were so successful that by 1921, when he visited Harvard University and Yale, he felt that no-stop decompression, there were no bubbles. And so his 2-to-1 ratio and the development of the tables based on that ratio assumed that no bubbles were formed. However, since the mid to late 60s, ultrasound has been employed, and it's detected bubbles on the no-stop decompression limit. So, for example, 10 meters for a few hours will generate bubbles. In fact, even less pressures. So what tables do is to limit the dose of bubbles to the point where they don't develop symptoms. And so it limits the circulating bubbles, but it also limits the soil that they can end up in. So, for example, in the spinal cord, which has some fatty areas, if bubbles actually arrive in the spinal cord, they might grow if the tissue oxygen, nitrogen, dissolved nitrogen, is high. The key to nitrox, increasing the PO2 for a given depth, that increases what's termed unsaturation. Now, unsaturation is because oxygen is a metabolic gas. So magically, it disappears. So let me give you an example where this is actually used in everyday medicine. Someone who has a lung collapse that allows air outside the lung in the chest as a pocket is given oxygen to breathe. So the air that is in the pocket of gas has a partial pressure of nitrogen. When oxygen is breathed, that partial pressure is the driving force, the gradient down which the nitrogen is removed into the breathing gas. So instead of about 21 days to reduce a pneumothorax just by breathing air, it can be reduced to about 3 days. So this unsaturation, because of the metabolic use of oxygen, allows upward excursions from a given depth without any risk of bubble formation. After that point, then the risk of gas formation increases as the absolute pressure is reduced. So just a brief reminder of decompression sickness, because they really are quite different phenomena. And here I have experimental experience of using multi-element arrays on tissues during decompression in human divers. During the late 1980s, I experimented with group from Norway and group from Oxford, in which we actually watched the gas formation in the human thigh on 40-meter air dives. And the gas can form in sheets in tissues, most especially in joints. Sometimes, of course, there are skin rashes, and Haldane included skin rashes along with joint pain. Since then, we know that skin rashes are actually due to the presence of bubbles within skin itself. Type 2 or serious decompression sickness, not often seen today, the chokes or respiratory distress, is one example of an adult respiratory distress syndrome, and is due to bubbles arriving in the lung from distant tissues. And then finally, neurological symptoms relate to bubbles entering the nervous system. Haldane's original classification included convulsions and death, because people were doing extremely long duration deep air dives and forming a lot of gas. Now, I've picked out this statement from Haldane's work that he published in the Journal of Hygiene in London the following year in 1908. And this really is an extraordinarily perceptive statement. First of all, he realizes that the bubbles involved on decompression will be very, very small. Lung barotrauma with embolism allows the respired gas to enter the circulation, and those are macro bubbles. However, decompression sickness forms extremely small bubbles from small gas nuclei, and they are capable of passing through the lung capillaries. Most do not. Most are arrested in the lung. I'm sure most of you will have known that the PFO has been raised as a risk factor in the last few decades, because a PFO or atrial septal defect of any kind may allow bubbles to pass from the low pressure side on the right side of the circulation into the arterial high pressure side. However, if bubbles that have escaped through the lung pass to the spinal cord, which he says may be slowly desaturating, in other words, it's taken up a lot of nitrogen, they may increase in size. And he offers two explanations for the paraplegia, which he knew as diver's palsy. They may produce serious blockage of the circulation or direct mechanical damage. And it's this latter factor that has proven to be absolutely correct. The direct mechanical damage is due to the fact that bubbles, inoffensive bubbles, can actually damage the lining of blood vessels. It's called the endothelium, and bubbles have high surface tension. And work that I did with Professor Brian Hills in Australia actually showed that bubbles, because of their surface tension, can actually damage the endothelium, even roll up the cells like a carpet. This damage causes swelling, and edema is simply the name for increased water content in the tissues. And this immediately introduces a factor which is unfortunately overlooked, that any water barrier in a membrane or a surrounding cells limits oxygen supply, because oxygen is poorly soluble in water, which is why we have in our circulation red blood cells. We need red blood cells to carry large volumes of oxygen for our metabolism. We cannot exist on the water dissolved in plasma because it's insufficient to sustain life, unless, of course, you have a chamber. because at 3 times atmospheric pressure, breathing 100% oxygen, you would not even lose consciousness with no red blood cells in the circulation. This paper, Life Without Blood, was published in 1960 from the University of Amsterdam, Professor Boerema and his group. However, if cells and the membrane of cells develop swelling because of the increased water content, then hypoxia develops. It's simply a lowering of the oxygen level. And I've used the acronym HIF-1, which stands for hypoxia-inducible factor 1. And this relates to genetic regulation by oxygen. And this is a master protein that its level depends on the available oxygen in cells. So we're into an area now of immense complexity, and we don't have time to expand on that. Suffice it to say that the mechanisms involved in this astonishing regulation by oxygen were the subject of the 2019 Nobel Prize. However, the damage to the endothelium attracts white blood cells. This is how we defend against microbial damage. Either viruses or bacteria can damage the lining of blood vessels, and they cause inflammation. So this is the primary response of our defenses against viruses and bacteria. White blood cells actually then, attracted to the site of damage, get into tissue and actually kill viruses and bacteria. Well, when I got involved in the early 70s in the diving activity offshore, having been trained in the Navy, it was obvious that there was a significant problem in the southern sector of the North Sea with air diving. I recall that the medical group based in Yarmouth, called the North Sea Medical Centre, one year flew offshore to a total of 39 divers who had type 2 decompression sickness. However, my remit was generally in relation to helium and oxygen diving in the northern sector of the North Sea, and it was very rare to see neurological decompression sickness. So I wrote to the Chief Inspector of Diving in 1978, and he then commissioned a study by a former Royal Navy Surgeon Commander called Thomas Shields. And these are the figures for air diving in the North Sea, covering the 4 years from the beginning of 1982 to the end of 1986, with the black squares representing serious decompression sickness. Divers, of course, are not keen to report. If they report neurological decompression sickness and it's in the logbook, then it's usually don't ring us, we'll ring you. And 2 episodes and they're permanently unfit to dive. So this represents the tip of an iceberg. As you can see, there are some cases which really are very surprising. 10 meters for a total bottom time of 30 minutes with a serious incident. What it tells us is that we cannot use pain in a joint as any kind of marker of type 2 decompression sickness. There was a diving safety memorandum issued in July of 1986, which drew a so-called safety line, which is the line, the top line of the curve goes through the decompression sickness cases. And you'll see that there are cases on the line and cases on the wrong side of the line. But what this did in commercial diving in the North Sea, and for that matter in other gas fields, was to make air diving, certainly beyond 30 meters, impossible economically. And the switch was made to nitrox. It has just about eliminated the problem. So this is real data from real human diving that nitrox is the gas to use. But I need to talk a bit about bubbles in blood vessels, because the interesting point is that the lining of blood vessels is covered by water repellency agents. They're called surfactants, and they're well known in industry. And so bubbles actually remove this water repellency in blood vessels and damaging the lining. And when they open the barrier that prevents agents from blood reaching the nervous system, it causes the attraction of white blood cells, inflammation, and hypoxia. And as I've already alluded to, this protein, master protein, was awarded, the research was awarded the Nobel Prize. So adding oxygen to air and creating nitrox by increasing the PO2 obviously reduces the nitrogen partial pressure. It increases the ascent from bottom without saturating, without supersaturation of the gases in tissues. However, there are additional benefits from using nitrox, and these were not known in the 1980s. The cardiac output is directly related to the amount of oxygen we breathe. So if we're breathing 21% and we breathe genuinely 100% oxygen, which is a 5 times increase, that lowers the cardiac output. If we breathe oxygen at 10 meters, that's 2 bar pressure, you get a 20% reduction in cardiac output. That also means, again, because oxygen is the reason for blood flow, the primary reason for blood flow, it means that tissues around the body actually get less nitrogen. It's simply less blood flow equals less nitrogen and less tissue loading of nitrogen. However, there's an additional benefit because the increase of oxygen in nitrox actually is a protection against any bubbles circulating because it downregulates the genes and stops the white blood cells attaching to blood vessels. So now we're into the realm of oxygen and inflammation. So to summarize, nitrox reduces the cardiac workload, reduces bubble formation and that risk, protects from inflammation due to bubbles, and oxygen even before a dive is protected. Now this is the work of Stephen Thom, who at the time was in the University of Pennsylvania, and he showed that if an animal is given a high level of oxygen before a provocative dive, it doesn't develop decompression sickness. Well, of course, in increasing the oxygen level, the question of toxicity arises. And here, pulmonary oxygen toxicity was described by Lorraine Smith at the turn of the last century. So there is no doubt that the lung can suffer. The question is, what is the mechanism by which the lung suffers? And despite years and years of research, mainly in America, that mechanism wasn't determined until a very short time ago, perhaps a decade ago. Someone actually allowed animals to develop severe pulmonary oxygen toxicity and then gave a monoclonal antibody, CD40. What does it do? It actually neutralizes the white blood cell attack. So the oxygen level is dangerous because it leads to white blood cells attacking the blood vessels in the lung itself. But that can be actually stopped by giving this monoclonal antibody. It stops the white blood cells from attacking the lung itself. Now, this is a complex area, but I've actually covered all of this in the book that I published some years ago, and I'll show you the cover in a moment. Also in the book, I dealt with cerebral oxygen toxicity, and this was related to observations I made of divers and, for that matter, a doctor in a chamber and looking at the blood vessels in the retina. It's the only place you can see blood vessels. And some people, under some circumstances, get huge amounts of constriction of the blood vessels from oxygen. However, they may get that on one day, and you look the second day, and it's not there. In other words, whatever phenomenon is causing convulsions due to high levels of oxygen, it's exceedingly variable. That variation was observed in the Royal Navy by Ken Donald, who at that time was a surgeon lieutenant commander during the war. And he was responsible for all the Navy research that went on in Gosport near Portsmouth on using oxygen as a diving gas. And he made a diver stand on the bottom of Horsesea Lake in 70 feet of water, breathing pure oxygen, day in, day out, and recorded the point at which this man developed symptoms and signs of oxygen toxicity. The timing rate ranged from 17 minutes to 123 minutes. What a colossal variation. But the most important thing is that after a convulsion, people regain consciousness immediately. And I've witnessed that firsthand, again in Royal Navy, in 2 divers on an experimental dive. So from a practical point of view, with the sort of partial pressures of oxygen you're using as amateur divers using nitrox, neither of these are in any way significant. But it leads me on to another aspect of John Scott Haldane's work, and that is the use of oxygen. Because it was Haldane who used oxygen during the First World War when the Germans released chlorine at Ypres, 6,000 cylinders, and they were opened and the gas was drifted across the troops of the Allies, and Haldane was asked for advice. He devised a protective mask and he devised this equipment as a treatment. The very first time that a tight-fitting oronasal mask was ever used, and it has a reservoir bag. And he used, therefore, 100% oxygen in people who'd sustained lung damage from chlorine. Now, if pulmonary oxygen toxicity is due to inflammation from oxygen, then you would not want to add more oxygen to that equation. It was brilliantly successful. This is the cover of my book in which I discuss all of these issues, and I didn't write it to make money. I wrote it because the information that it contains is all published, but it's not featured in medical education. It's not featured in our medical schools. It's not featured in the training of people who give our anesthetics or people who actually are employed in our intensive care units. And that brings me on to, this is the special chapter about pulmonary oxygen toxicity and convulsions. It's chapter number 5. But I want to talk briefly about COVID because it's so topical. And ironically, the damage of the virus is due to the invasion of the endothelial lining of blood vessels. The receptor involved has been identified. It causes tissue swelling, edema. It attracts white blood cells, inflammation, and hypoxia. So that's why we need to give oxygen, not just to get hemoglobin saturated. Well, I've been doing research for a background article on the use of oxygen for what's termed long COVID. In other words, those people who've survived short COVID and now have a veritable panoply of symptoms ranging from still having lung problems to mental fogging and other problems. This is actually a paper about the original SARS-CoV, and this is October 2007. SARS-CoV-2, or otherwise known as COVID-19, is the second coronavirus pandemic. And this one actually was contained politically, mainly within China, and I think only killed 15,000 people. The paper says coronaviruses are well known to undergo genetic recombination, may lead to new genotypes and outbreaks. Presence of a large reservoir of SARS-CoV-like viruses in horseshoe bats, together with the culture of eating exotic mammals in southern China, is a time bomb. the possibility of the re-emergence of SARS and other novel viruses from animals or laboratories, and therefore the need for preparedness should not be ignored. It was suggested in the paper that SARS was transmitted in commercial aircraft during the epidemic. Out of a total of 40 flights investigated in China, 5 were associated with probable in-flight SARS transmission affecting 37 passengers. Most of the affected passengers sat within 5 rows of the person who was infectious. So long COVID. The reason why we've got long COVID is because short COVID has not been treated with sufficient oxygen. When people are given oxygen, it's entirely to ensure hemoglobin saturation. The oxygen is not being given to treat the damage in the nervous system. And of course, as divers, you will all know that we do this. We treat damage in the nervous system in type 2 decompression sickness and have done with pure oxygen since the Goodman and Workman paper in the 1960s. Boris Johnson got high flow oxygen somewhere between 40 and 60 litres a minute up his nose in St Thomas's Hospital. He was taken from Downing Street because he was on, I think, 4 litres a minute, and he was desaturating. And so he was given 100% oxygen, and this was based on American work. High flow oxygen saves lives. Thank you for listening, and I'm very happy to take any questions.